Good morning, 4th and 5th graders. How's your day? Start out, Bible, 100% true and accurate. Christianity is a relationship with Jesus. It is not joining a club. It's not buying a ticket. It's a relationship with Jesus. Christians, you guys are different from the world, from the other kids in your class. That's a good thing. God created the heavens and the earth. Evolution does not make sense. Today, it is Esther. She's standing up for what is right. Okay, to set this up, the Israelites at this time are captive. They're not in their own country, and they're in another land. They're captives by another country, and they can't go back. It's a sad time. They don't trust God. And you know what happens in the cycles when they don't trust God and things are bad. Now, to set this up, there are names in here that you're not familiar with. We don't have them as schoolmates, and we probably don't know people with these names. That's the reason I put the players up here. Queen Esther is secretly a Jew. Mordecai is Esther's cousin, and he's a king's official. He's a Jew. And he's a good guy. Haman is evil, and he's a king's official as well, and he hates the Jews. King Xerxes, of course, is king. And then here's a word that you're probably not familiar with. It's called Purim, and it means to cast lots, and it's a Jewish holiday. We'll get to that at the end of the story and what that's all about. This is Esther. While the Israelites were held captive in Persia, a Jewish woman named Esther became queen to King Xerxes of Persia. Esther's cousin Mordecai refused to bow down to one of the king's officials named Haman. Mordecai, also one of the king's officials, was a Jew, and he wouldn't dishonor God by bowing to any man. Haman became very angry because of Mordecai's refusal to bow down to him. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He decided it was not enough just to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Since he had learned that Mordecai was a Jew, he decided to destroy all Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. Okay, now Haman, he was a descendant of the Amalekites. We haven't heard that word before, but it's a different country, and this Amalekite nation hated the Jews. They were enemies of the Jews, and that was transferred to Haman. He hated the Jews. So, in the month of April, lots were cast. We found out last week what lots were. And in some kind of bowl, they put stones in there and mix them around with markings on them. And they will make decisions depending on how they land in the bowl or the container. It's like drawing straws. Remember that from last week? So they drew lots, and they selected a day. The next year, it was March 7th, almost a year after that. Then Haman, evil Haman, approached King Xerxes and said, "There is a certain race of people scattered throughout the province of your empire," and that's true. "Their laws are different from any other nation," and that's true. But, he said, they refuse to obey even the laws of the king. Now, that's a lie. So, and he tells the king, "It's not in the king's interest to let them live. So if it please your majesty, issue a decree that they be destroyed, and I'll give your warehouse, your government, 375 tons of silver if you do this." And of course, he doesn't have the money, but his plan is to plunder, to take money from the existing Jews from their household and give it to the king. That's his plan. So the king agreed confirming his decision by removing his signet ring from his finger. Now, a signet ring, it was a special ring that had markings on it. So if there was a decree given or a letter written from the king, they would fold it up and get wax, put warm wax on it, and then put the ring imprint on that wax, and they would know it was from the king. So anyway, Haman got the ring, and he's going to issue this decree. And the king says, just keep the money. He said, go ahead and do as you like with these people. So on April 17th, Haman called the king's secretaries and dictated letters to everybody in the country in all of their languages, and the letters were signed in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with his ring. So he sent messengers all over the nation saying, a year from now, on March 7th, that you have to kill all of the Jews in your area. The property of the Jews would be given to those who killed them. So here's an incentive for them to do that. The town that they were in was called Susa, and it fell into confusion because there were a lot of Jews there. Here is Mordecai, and when he learned about it, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went out into the city crying with a loud, bitter wail. Okay, we found out in past lessons that it's showing distress when he puts on sackcloth and sits in ashes and cries and wails. He's in distress and is showing his sadness. He stood outside the palace, the gate of the palace, for no one was allowed to enter while wearing clothes in mourning. As the news of the king's decree reached all the provinces, there was a great mourning, a sadness among all the Jews. They fasted, they went without food, they wept and wailed, and many of the people lay in sackcloth and ashes. Okay, now Queen Esther's at the palace, and she's separated from the rest of the people. But the maids came and told Esther about it. So back and forth, she went to Mordecai and asked what Mordecai knew about what was going on. They went back and forth, and Mordecai urged Esther to go to the king and urge her to go to the king, beg for mercy. He also asked some of the servants going back and forth to beg for mercy and plead for her people. Okay. Now, Queen Esther, she's in a predicament. She's the queen. She's a Jew in secret, and the king has he's got a policy that anybody that comes before the king that's not announced, that he doesn't ask for, and if he decides, he can have that person killed on the spot. And if he holds out his scepter, now the scepter would be like a staff, a special cane type thing, and it shows his authority. If he holds it out, then the person coming before him unannounced is okay. So here's Esther. She's risking her life just by going before the king. So she's in a predicament. Mordecai encourages her. This is probably the most important passage of the whole book of Esther. He said, if you keep quiet in a time like this, he said, deliverance from the Jews will come to some other place, but you and your relatives will die. What's more, who can say that you have been elevated to the palace for such a time as this? Okay, so this is her time. She needs to act. She's been elevated to queen, and Mordecai is encouraging her to do what's right. So Esther sent this reply, go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it's against the law, I will go see the king. If I must die, I am willing to die. So Mordecai went away and did as Esther told him. 3 days later, Esther put on her royal robes, entered the inner courts unannounced, just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there, he welcomed her, holding out his gold scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched its tip. And the king said to her, "What do you want, Queen Esther? What's your request? I will give it to you, even if it's half the kingdom." And she said, "Well, tomorrow I would like to have a banquet here with you and me and Haman. And I think we ought to have a banquet." And the king said, "Okay." And so they had a banquet at that time. And at the banquet, the king asked, "What do you want? I'll give you half the kingdom." He says, "Well, I'd like to have another banquet, you and me and Haman, tomorrow." Okay, so here's Haman. He's attended one. He's going to attend the other. We'll find out what kind of a guy he is. He said, "What a happy man Haman was as he left the banquet. But when he saw Mordecai sitting at the gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, he was furious. However, he restrained himself and went home. Then he gathered with his friends and his wife. He boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children. He bragged about the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all the other officials and leaders. He was second in charge." Then Haman added, "That's not all. Queen Esther invited me only and the king to a banquet she prepared for us tomorrow, and she's invited me to dine with her, and it's just the three of us." Then he added, "But all this is meaningless as long as I see Mordecai, the Jew, sitting there at the city gate." So his wife suggested, "Oh, you don't like him? We don't like Jews. Why don't you put up a gallows?" Okay, you know what a gallows is, and that's where they execute people. And he said, "Make it 75 feet tall." Why that tall? Well, it's that all the people in town will see it, and they'll know what happens to people that do not respect Haman. Okay, that night, the king had trouble sleeping. He had a dream, or he did not have a dream. He ordered the attendant to bring the records of his kingdom. And in those records, he found out how Mordecai has exposed a plot of two people that were going to kill the king. And so the king said, "Well, what happened to Mordecai? Did we reward him in any way?" And they said, "No, nothing's been done." As it happened, Haman just arrived. And so he came in and asked Haman, he says, "What should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me?" Okay, Haman thinks it's about him, that he is pleasing the king, so he makes up something. And he replied, "You should bring out one of the king's royal robes, as well as the king's own horse, with a royal emblem on its head. Instruct one of the king's most noble princes to dress the man in the king's robe and to lead him through the city square on the king's own horse. Have the prince shout as they go. This is what happens to those the king wishes to honor." Of course, he thought this was going to be himself. And the king said, "Excellent." The king said to Haman, "Hurry and get the robe and my horse and do all that you've said, and do this to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate in the palace." And he says, "Don't fail to carry this out." So he carried it through and led Mordecai, his enemy, around on a horse and honored Mordecai. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And while they were drinking that day, the king asked her, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I'll give it to you, even if it's half the kingdom." So Esther replied, "If your majesty is pleased with me and wants to grant my request, it is my petition, and that my life and the lives of my people be spared." Now she's revealing at this time that she's a Jew. "For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill all of us Jews. If we had only been sold as slaves, I would remain quiet, for that would be a matter too trivial to warrant to disturb the king. Who would do such a thing? King Xerxes demanded. Who would dare touch you? And Esther replied, this wicked Haman is our enemy. So Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out of the room into the palace garden. But Haman stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that he was doomed. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king returned to the palace garden. And the king saw this, and it looked like an attack on Queen Esther by Haman. And he said, will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my eyes? The king roared. And as soon as the king spoke, the attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. And then one of the king's attendants said, well, Haman set up a gallows. It stands 75 feet tall in the courtyard. He intended to use it on Mordecai. And the king said, then hang Haman on it. So Haman was history. He was hanged on his own gallows. Now, once more, King Esther came before the king begging him, because, you know, when they made that declaration, proclamation, and sealed it with his ring, it could not be revoked. It was permanent, and they didn't know what to do. So Esther went to the king, and they decided to give the ring to Mordecai, and between Esther and Mordecai, they would decide what would happen to their predicament, because a year from then, the Jews were going to be killed by the people of Susa. They came up with a good plan, and they sent out a decree to all of the nations around Susa, and they said, when this happens, you can, to the Jews, you can defend themselves. The Jews can defend themselves against everything. And this made the people afraid of the Jews, and lo and behold, nothing happened a year from them. So a year from them, it was March 7th, and it's when Israel was delivered from their fate, and they called it Purim. Okay, Purim is when they cast lots and figured the date, but the Jews today will celebrate that day, a holiday for them, and they call it Purim. So now you know what Purim is. Okay, Esther stood up for what was right. And object lesson, of course. She stood up under the heat, didn't she? Okay, now we have a cup here. If I put this on the cup, this is probably what's going to happen if I put this over the flame. However, we've got a clean cup here, and what if I put Holy Spirit in the cup? You know what the Holy Spirit is? We found that from last lessons, and it will help us in our decisions on what to say, what to do is right, and how to stand up under the heat. Okay, do we have that close enough? Is that close enough on there? We'll see. Is it going to do this? I don't know. I'll put a little closer on there. Make it interesting. So we got Holy Spirit in there that's going to keep us from temptation when we come across situations where we have to make a decision. Okay, I have put on the board some real life situations and some responses to that you may give. What if, okay, this is doing the right thing. What if you're at home, or you've invited friends over, or you're at a friend's house, or you go to a movie theater, and you're watching a movie. Okay, here it comes. 5 minutes into it, there are some really bad words, and there's violence. People are really mean to each other. What do? You got your friends around. You don't want to look bad. You want to stay popular. You want to be their friends. However, are you going to do what Esther did? To stand up what is right. Here are some suggestions. You might say, let's not watch this. Okay, just be brave and speak out. You could go to another room, you could leave. Or if you're in a theater, I don't know if you and your parents, your family has ever walked out of a theater or performance, but if it's bad, you don't want to fill your computer mind with that kind of stuff. Okay, 2, what if somebody's telling an off-color joke, and you've heard them before, the dirty jokes with the bad words in them, and they're off-color, they're not good. This is what my daughter likes to say. She'll just say, that's terrible. And not being mean, not trying to put the person down, but just showing her disapproval. I like that one the best, I think. Or you could say, I don't think that's funny. Or you can motion, I've done this before. Remember in business meetings, before they start, people will sometimes get off on those kind of things. And I will end up plugging my ears like this. And they'll look and they know where I'm coming from. And I stood up, I guess. It wasn't a big deal. I just ended up plugging my ears. And in time, they didn't act that way around me. And I think it was just because of that motion. Okay, now what's going on here? Ooh, I wonder if that's getting close. So is it standing up under the heat? Okay, here's another one, gossip. You could say, you know what gossip is, and you're telling things that could be true, they may not be true about people, and you could say it's just not good to talk about people behind their back. We've heard that before from our parents, and they'll say, well, if you don't have anything good to say about somebody, don't say anything at all. Can we change the subject, or can we talk about something else? Okay, what if, I've run into this a lot, and you're sitting in the back of a class or an auditorium, and your friends are talking, and they're giggling, and they're working, talking with each other, and it's disruptive. What do? And this is what I did. I usually would move to the front or just not sit with them because I knew what they were going to do. You could stand up like Esther did and just shh. And you've heard people do that. It's kind of gutsy to take a leadership role and just say, this isn't good. Okay, how are we doing here? Oh, man. Holy Spirit must be working in there. Okay, what about bad language? We talked about that before. This is what my daughter says. She says, I hate that word. And hate's a pretty strong word to use about anything. But you just say, I hate that word. Or if they're going to talk like that, choose different friends or just walk away. Okay, 2 verses. This is from James 2. Talking about Esther standing up. What good is it, my brothers, if a man claims to have faith, claim to be a Christian, but has no deeds? And then in James 2:17, in the same way, faith, or being a Christian itself, if it is not accompanied by action, it is dead. Okay, I like my version in here better than both of those. They're a little clearer. The first one is, what's the use of saying you have faith and you don't prove it by your actions? Okay, the second one, faith that doesn't show itself by good deeds is no faith at all. It's dead and useless. So, James says, as a summary, If you're a Christian, prove it. Okay, so we did stand up, just like Esther. Didn't burn through, stood up under the heat, and did the right thing. Good lesson from Esther. See you next week.